Ian Millhiser on the line with us. He is the constitutional policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, the editor of Think Progress is Just. He's the Think Progress Justice editor, and the author of a new book, Injustices: The Supreme Court's Nearly Unbroken History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. And Ian, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be back. Thank you so much.
It's great to have you with us. You wrote a piece here recently. It was the version that I saw got picked up by Think Progress, I believe. Well, actually, yeah, that's where you write. It would make sense.
No, it's a go figure.
Yeah, basically on the immoral intellectual roots of libertarianism. Major libertarian thinker on human failures. It is best they should die. Tell us about this.
Sure. I mean, this has been a fascinating little rabbit hole that I've climbed down. So it started out where, like, I wrote this piece about Rand Paul and, like, his notion that civil rights laws, or at least many of them, are unconstitutional, and that private businesses should be allowed to discriminate as much as they want. And I was trying to figure out, like, what are the intellectual origins of this man's philosophy that would lead him to, such a strange view. And in the process of this piece, this guy, Herbert Spencer. Spencer died in 1903. He's hardly a household name, but he's the father of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the idea that certain people are defective and we shouldn't provide them services and we should just allow them to starve and die. Right. Which sadly was a very, I discuss this in my book, was a very influential philosophy in the 19th century. And as soon as this piece went up, within hours, the Cato Institute was this, which is probably the flagship libertarian group in the country.
Right, and formerly
an attack on. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, whenever I mention the Cato Institute, I point out that it started as its original name was the Charles Koch Foundation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a Koch-funded group. Very, very well-funded, influential libertarian group. They freaked out that I was attacking Herbert Spencer, and then a few hours after that, Reason Magazine, which is the flagship publication of the libertarian movement, freaked out that I was attacking this guy. And that was when I knew I had paid her, because if this guy's just some random long-dead crank, why would you care if I criticize some random long-dead crank?
Right.
The fact that they are fighting so hard to, cover up what this guy means makes me think that, I think confirms my accusation that they look to him for inspiration.
Right, and you're also citing Sir John Galton, as I recall, or Sir Herbert? No, who was it? What was his first name?
Yeah, I mean, Galton is branch. So
yeah.
I mean,
but one of these guys was Darwin's cousin, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was Darwin's cousin. I mean, he is another odious figure who has less of an influence on libertarians than Spencer did. Mm-hmm. Galton is the father of eugenics.
Ah, yeah.
And what's interesting about eugenics is, eugenics was horrible. Eugenics was the idea that you prevent people that he deemed defective from breeding so that they wouldn't pass on these traits.
Right, and we were sterilizing Native American communities in the United States. The state of Vermont believed for a long time that they had completely wiped out the Abenaki Indians, for example. And the posters from the eugenics movement in the United States and in Great Britain in the 1920s were taken to Germany by Hitler and used as prototypes for his eugenics movement.
And it wasn't always just racist. I mean, in my book, I discussed the Buxby Bell case, which was a woman. She was actually a white woman, but she somehow was labeled an imbecile, which was the word they used in those days. She actually was intelligent, but they labeled her an imbecile, and they sterilized her for that. And the Supreme Court said it was right.
Right.
I mean, what's interesting about eugenics, though, I mean, I don't want to lay eugenics necessarily at libertarians' feet, is that eugenics was actually started as a more moderate alternative to Spencer. Spencer's attitude was to just allow these people to starve to death. And the eugenicists said, no, that's too cruel. How about we just give them?
Right.
So, I mean, I don't want to defend either side because both of them are monstrous. But again, it was a very mean time in American history. It was a time when the Supreme Court, wouldn't let there be any business regulation, and that, in some ways was influenced by Spencer. It was a time when we didn't have any meaningful welfare programs, And, even and the responses that people came up as alternatives to those were often equally monstrous. Mm-hmm. So, I go back to my original point, like, why are there now people in this country who would look back to anyone who thought that way? Would look back to someone like Spencer and find inspiration in it.
Yeah, it's sort of a secular Calvinism. The John Calvin didn't explicitly promote this, and it's no longer the position of the Calvinist Church. But for a long time, for I think probably over a century, the essential message of the Calvinist Church was we're all born sinners, we're all evil, but we have to have leaders. So how do we figure out who among us has been blessed by God, is less evil, or is actually even good? And the way that we find that out is we look around and see who God blessed with money. So the richest people among us are the best, and they're the ones that we should put in charge of everything. I mean, it's Calvinism. And
there's certainly, whether you're talking about social Darwinism, whether you're talking about libertarianism, or whether you're talking about, the other branch of this thinking, which was eugenics, there's certainly a sense that, like, it's not the role of society to, to equalize the unfairness in the world.
Caring for the weak is, as we do, is, and no shortage of people in the Old Testament as well. Caring for the weak is, in the eyes of these guys, in the eyes of libertarians and Ayn Randites, basically a betrayal of.
And what makes no sense to me about this way of viewing the world is, I read when I was researching my book a lot of the tracts that were produced in the 1930s when Roosevelt was implementing the New Deal. A lot of businessmen were really scared, like, not just that this would hurt their bottom line, but this had never been tried before, and they were afraid that, like, this new thing of having a modern regulatory and welfare state would be very damaging to the economy and to the country. And, it's one thing to believe that in 1936 when it's new and we don't have much evidence either way, but since then, we've had 80 years of American history.
Right.
And in those 80 years of American history, we grew to be the wealthiest nation that has ever existed and the most powerful nation that has ever existed. So, you made your arguments, guys, and we tried this out. As it turns out, you were wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Reaganomics has been an absolute screaming failure for the last 35 years. And FDR-onomics, or Keynesian economics, built this country in the 20th century. It's pretty hard to deny.
Yeah, no, and, to bring it back to where we started, what is frightening about, the political conversation in the country right now is that there is an attempt to refight these battles in a way that, just hasn't been the case. Like, George W. Bush is not my favorite president,
right.
But George W. Bush expanded Medicare. And it was good that he expanded Medicare.
Right.
George W. Bush had a program in Africa to help people get AIDS treatment. That was a wonderful thing.
Right.
So, there used to be a consensus, amongst Democrats and Republicans that there is an appropriate role for government. And unfortunately, that consensus is broken down, and now we seem to be having a fight over whether or not we should go back to the 19th century.
Yeah. And we've got a bunch of billionaires who are throwing hundreds of millions of dollars into our elections to try to make sure that that's the case.
That's exactly right. And, like, the people who will benefit the most from living in this sort of, one of the people I cite in this piece described it as anarchist capitalism.
Right.
The people who will do great in an anarchist capitalist society are, people like the Koch brothers who are, already have all the resources in the world to fall back on.
Right. Have you seen Mark Ames's reporting on this? It was a couple of years ago, an alternate where he went back and found that in 1946, I think it was, or maybe 47, it was right after World War II, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and a bunch of very, very large corporations got together and invented a political party, basically, to provide an intellectual and business rationalization for business-friendly policies, and they invented the modern Libertarian Party.
Oh, that's interesting. Is this the Liberty League that you're referring to? Or is this?
I think it started out with that name, yes.
Yeah. So,
and then it
I mean,
morphed into the Libertarian
about
Party.
the Liberty League in my book. I mean, the Liberty League was like, it was this group of reactionary. I mean, what we would now call them libertarians, but
Right.
it was funded by the DuPont family, who was sort of the Koch family of the era. And, you know, the quotations from the early Liberty League meetings, one of the people who helped start the Liberty League was an executive at the DuPont company. And the thing that inspired him to do it was that Roosevelt was providing all these jobs to people, including to a lot of black folks in the South. And this guy had a vacation home in South Carolina, and all of a sudden his black worker said, I'm not going to work for you anymore because the government's paying me more money. And since he couldn't get the cheap African-American labor anymore, he was outraged that all of a sudden that was a tremendous overreach of government, and he went on to help found the Liberty League.
Amazing. This stuff is just astonishing. Ian Millhiser, constitutional policy analyst over at Center for American Progress, thinkprogress.org, and his book, Injustices. Thank you, Ian.